All right, Elizabeth, thank you for joining us today. For anybody that does not know who you are or hasn't followed your work, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and explain, where you are and where you've been on your strength and conditioning journey.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, my name is Elisabeth. I'm coaching now full time for more than 5 years already. So it's been a while. I started. I was like, I think my story is like similar to a lot of strength and conditioning coaches. I was a horrible athlete, just not talented enough. Um, just not, I just didn't have it. Like I just didn't have it. So then I went into coaching, and I started actually as a Olympic weightlifting coach at the German Weightlifting Federation. This is my first job was managing the youth department of the federation. And then I switched more into coaching roles, and later on was head of talent identification and development of German weightlifting. And I left that role to like start kind of like work as a freelance coach and travel the world a bit and coach in different countries. That was like after the pandemic, or not, we are still in the, kind of in the pandemic, but whatever. So yeah, last year I worked in Luxembourg in football and basketball. While I was actually at German weightlifting, I had a lot of stints in rugby. I was with German Rugby Union, like on an interim basis, at the 2019 Rugby European Championships as a SSC coach. I did various internships in South Africa, and yeah, this year, beginning of this year, 2022. I went to the Stormers in South Africa, and I wrote my master's dissertation in cooperation with SA Rugby about junior development, or the transition from junior rugby to senior rugby. And now currently I'm in Saudi Arabia in a head of strength and conditioning role at Mahad Academy, and I oversee 5 sports at the moment. Athletics, karate, taekwondo, judo, handball, and I probably forgot one. No, that's 5. Yeah, these 5 sports.
So with the
Yeah.
diverse background that you have, and you did mention the fact of, hammering home the rugby stuff. How did you feel going into some of those other sports that you're currently head of right now?
Yeah, so basically, I think having this weightlifting background has always been kind of a burden, because everyone always just saw me as like the barbell chick, like the one who does barbell exercises with kids or weightlifting with kids and like Olympic lifting and so much. So it's actually been a burden. So I always try to work with as many different sports as possible, especially in order to get like a feeling for how to measure physical demands of different sports, and then according to that, how to develop strength and conditioning support. And I've always been very fascinated by like just competition and different competitive sports. And like with my rugby background and the weightlifting background, I would say it's quite easy now to work with martial arts like taekwondo, judo, or karate, because like at the end of the day, it's like different, but it's the same. Or I always say it's the same, but different. The principles apply in almost every sport, where you have some kind of body contact. So like I actually use a lot of contact drills that I've done in rugby. I use them now for sports like taekwondo or judo, or which is quite helpful. The same with like the handball players, which is more, they have a contact aspect as well. I don't know, you don't play handball in the US, so I think it's more like a PE thing in the US, but it's pretty popular in Europe. And it's also pretty popular here in the Middle East. And you have a contact aspect, so they jumping, going into contact, getting blocked. So I actually use a lot that I've done in rugby, I use now as well. The principles remain, just sometimes you have slight changes, but that's it. Yeah.
Like you said, handball is not very prevalent here in America. Neither would any of our American listeners know what athletics is. So what does that entail? What
Oh,
sport is that?
athletics is track and field.
Oh, okay, track and field. Got it.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
So,
athletics is track and field. Yeah.
okay. So again, for the rest of the American listeners out there, is that all sprinters, jumpers, hurdlers, and the throwers that you have? You have the entirety of that team?
So at the moment here, we only have sprinters and throwers. We have sprinters and shot put, and we have some like middle distance runners. I don't really work much with them, more with the sprinters. But they're all very young. So at the moment, it's more like they're like 15, 16. So it's more like the general athletic development pathway that they go through. Which is actually what the majority of athletes go through at that age. So it's not really that specific. In general, I would say I don't work super sport specific. I always get that question now, like what do you do different between like karate and taekwondo and track and whatever? When you work with at least youth athletes or junior athletes, like they are on like their development pathway, and like it's basically just building the foundations. You're not that sport specific, whatever that means for the majority of people. So you're just building like the usual, or the physical qualities like strength, power, and that's it. So I think we overcomplicate the sport specific part very often.
Going down that rabbit hole a little bit, with you having the Olympic weightlifting background and being an athlete yourself and coaching it, like you said, how do you balance utilizing that with any of your athletes that maybe people would say, oh, are you going to use your Olympic lifts with any of your distance runners? Or how do you, and especially like you just said, 16, 15, younger population, people would say, would you continue to use those principles of your Olympic lifting, or how do you go about doing that with that population and that age?
Yeah. So I would say I'm probably more like really unemotional in this whole debate about Olympic lifts in S&C. Like I know this discussion always pops up, and there are a lot of strength and conditioning coaches that are way more emotional about it than me. I think I've never used.
Well, people can get emotional about a lot of things.
Yeah. I think I've never used Olympic lifts. Some like assistance lift, or I call them assistant lifts, with pro rugby players, for example. I think the closest I came was like a clean pull or a push press, but that's not really Olympic lifting, for me at least as a weightlifting coach. But I've never done that with pro athletes. I also never done that with athletes, with youth athletes that I got already like after PHV, like after peak height velocity, because most of the time it's like it takes time to teach them, and there are so many people say, oh, I can teach a clean or a snatch in 10 minutes. No, you can't. They're imitating that movement in the moment, but they haven't learned it. So it's not really learning the Olympic lift so that you can actually load them, and that's the important part for me. That you can actually load them takes more time, because I've seen that a couple of times in rugby as well, where you have like 120 kilogram prop who's doing clean pulls of 100 kg, and then I'm like, you can just leave that. Or who's like reverse curling like 100 kilograms, which is like, okay, it's just a waste of time at this place, but if you load it more, his technique is just not good enough, and then I just leave that. So I don't do it with athletes that I get at the later stage. I am a huge fan, and I think those people that follow me on Twitter have seen that before. If I get children like before, like pre-puberty, I really like teaching snatches and cleans and jerks and all of that to them, because most of the time, like they are, it's easier for them to learn because they're not really in that growth spurt yet, so they don't have these coordination issues, mobility, etc. It's really fun for them. At least maybe like at least that's my experience. Like Olympic lifting is quite more fun for kids than doing goblet squats or like kettlebell deadlifts or whatever people do with kids. It's a strength training. So I actually aim for like teaching young kids Olympic lifts if they want to, of course, or if that's really interesting for them. But I don't really have the energy to work with kids, especially during the growth spurt when their arm length is basically changing every 2 weeks, and then you adjust every time, and then they're uncoordinated, and it's just tough, and like a waste of time, and you can actually chase adaptations of different exercises much easier and much quicker. So that's at least how I approach it, and that has worked for me so far. It's really nice to get athletes that are able to do them because they learned them as kids, but the moment they get into like where you can actually, I always say like the moment testosterone kicks in, you want to chase adaptations, because like testosterone for me is like natural doping. You want to use that time to make as much hypertrophy training as possible, gain strength and build that foundation during that time in youth development. So I don't want to spend that much time with teaching techniques, like at least not complex techniques. That's why I aim for strength training with kids and having more complex movements, teaching them as early as possible.
From a 10,000 foot view, what is, the overall progression then that you're going about, how you're handling your teams that you're working with right now with respect to, long-term athletic development and the principles you just talked about?
Yeah. So at the moment, I have different groups. So I have some kids that are 12 and below. They train like we try to like develop strength training competencies. That's what we call it. So we basically just try to teach them all kind of different strength training exercises so that they're able to execute the movements. So they are usually between 9 and 12, and everything I do with them is like, okay, we introduce them to all the different movement patterns that I think are important, like they're all able to squat, they're all able should all be able to do hinge patterns, lunges. I try to introduce them to as many different strength training exercises as possible, with different equipment. They all should be able to do kettlebell swings and like these kind, and I use a lot of dumbbells as well for like basic like floor press or goblet squats or whatever we do. And the moment they like, I try to track growth and maturation, which is at the moment a bit difficult for me because I don't have enough staff, but and I have way too many athletes and too many sports, and the sports coaches are not able to do that properly. So it's, I try to keep track of that, but the moment they enter like puberty or PHV, then later I basically reduce the complexity of the movements, and I hope that I have learned it already as kids. If they haven't, then we use more simple exercises, and then we trying to actually like methods, or strength training methods get more important than actually the exercises. So I'm really trying to build strength and power. I have a huge focus on hypertrophy training during puberty. That's what I do with these athletes at the moment. I don't have any adults right now, so like that's how I do it. I do have some 16, 17-year olds, or that are only, they've never done strength training before, and they only start now, which is like I try to keep it as simple as possible. So we do trap bar, these kind of like rather simple exercise selection. I'm not trying to teach them a clean. It's just not time-wise, that's not possible. Yeah.
Listening to you talk about that, and I guess this is a question that I'll throw to both of you. What would you say is the biggest difference / disconnect between strength and conditioning for youth athletes here in America and over in Europe? And I know you guys aren't over here right now, but just from things that you've seen and hearing you talk about, having that structure that you're going to have with people 12 and under, I feel like that just isn't continued the norm here, but it is over there. So opening it up to both of you guys, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't think it's the norm in Europe either. So there's still a lot of hesitation around strength training with kids, which is like, I really don't understand, because strength training with kids is not really strength training. It's actually just introducing them to move, to like all these different movements. You don't really load much, like you don't really have high intensities with kids, etc. So we are trying to, or what I'm trying to do is like more getting, or here in Europe, or not, I'm not in Europe right now, but in general, in Europe, what I try to do is like get away a bit from calling it strength and conditioning. We call it more like athletic development. And then we educate parents around like, okay, we only, with kids, we only do like basic strength training movements, and we don't load them. And this is kind of now in, especially in how the sports system works, at least in the countries I've worked at in Europe, that works pretty well in like academies and private clubs, because you kind of have a bigger impact. I'm coming from a country, or in Germany, we don't have school sports and we don't have college sports. So everything is organized privately in clubs or in academies, and you have a much bigger chance of convincing them than convincing like a whole school, or like having like to deal with all the administration and whatever. Like, at least I can imagine that this makes it much better, much more difficult. Here, like, or in Europe, if you look at soccer academies or the Olympic training centers, like kids get to Olympic training centers, at least in my country, very early. So they join them usually at the age of like 13, 14, and train there full time. So it's kind of, I think that whole early specialization debate, we don't really have that in, at least not in Germany, because early specialization is the way to go, and we are also pretty successful with that. It's successful in a way of like, all the majority of kids, or all, at least all kids that I've coached, it's not possible to play multiple sports because we don't have seasons. Like we actually play year round all sports, and it's super difficult then to play multiple sports. But what we try to do now is like at the Olympic training centers or the academies, we try to have in between the sport, we try to have athletic development, which covers other sports as well. They might not play this competitively, but we try to implement it in the usual athletic development program that we have. Like, let me give an example for when I worked for German Weightlifting Federation. Like, I mean, the weightlifting kids start very early. They started usually at the age of 10, 11, and they only do this. Sometimes maybe some of them play a bit of soccer twice a week, but that's it. And they go to the Olympic training centers at the age of usually 13, 14, and they don't do anything else. Like, they don't do any other sports. And then what we try to do is like, because they also train twice a day, we have one weightlifting session, and then we have like general athletic development, where I then try to for example, we play badminton, or we play like basketball just for fun, or we join another sport that's at the Olympic training center. And that's how we cover multiple sports and making different movement experiences. But yeah, at the end of the day, they're all playing competitively. They're doing all one sport.
That is, again, like that is a completely different model than we're used to here.
Yeah.
And that's what you're doing now. One of the big things that I wanted to talk with you about is what you had done in the past, and you mentioned it in your intro. Your master dissertation. So why don't we dive down that rabbit hole and let you kind of talk about that, because I think that's going to be something that provides a ton of value to our listeners right now.
Yeah. So basically, my master's project was a bit longer than expected. So yeah, so I tried to examine or not I tried, but I did examine the experiences of junior rugby players that are in the transition phase to senior professional rugby in South Africa. So it was, I had a couple of players that had just gotten their first contract basically, and they got integrated into the senior setup for the first time, but they were still playing under 20 junior rugby, but already trained with the seniors. And for me, what was most, or my question is, or the reason for my project was there are a lot of junior athletes that are really hyped up on under 20 level. They are really hyped up in school. I don't know if that happens in England as well, but at least in South Africa that happens a lot. You have these super talented players on under 20 level, and then they enter the senior setup and actually like are expected to drive or to thrive through that environment as well, and they just completely get lost, or a lot of them get injured, or and I've seen so many over the last, or since I'm involved in rugby, or I follow South African rugby now for over 10 years, I've seen so many good players on under 20 level that never made it, which is like kind of normal, but for me it's quite interesting to see what might be the reasons for that, why we have this, or why there's this huge graveyard of talented players, which is also kind of normal in a country where you have a big talent pool. But at the same time, from maybe an ethical perspective, you can question like, why are they getting lost in the senior setups? So yeah, so my project, I followed players, junior players, through this transition phase, and did interviews with them, like how they, what are the main challenges they face, and how do they cope with those challenges, and what do they think could be better in order for them to make it as a professional player. And also, what are the biggest differences to being in the senior setup and playing junior or schoolboy rugby. So this was kind of the intention of the project, and they're actually quite interesting results, or were for me personally interesting results. Obviously, from an athletic perspective, or from a sports perspective, the challenges they face are pretty obvious. It's just the game on senior levels just played so much faster than they've ever experienced before. One player just told me that like he couldn't, like when he first trained with the senior setup, he couldn't walk for the first two months. Everything was just painful, everything was just so fast, and he was actually questioning himself if he's ready for that, or if that's like he never experienced it to be that different. So a lot more physicality, especially when you look at the forwards. For the US people that are following forwards, they're usually the heavier guys. They struggle a lot with body weight, and the general physicality. And there was one player who said, even when we play touch, even if we like in South Africa, you don't play touch, you play like shoulder check touch. And he got shoulder checked by a Springbok. Like a Springbok is the national team player, like a very an older one, and he just got shoulder checked, and he said he had a massive bruise the next day. Couldn't even move his shoulder. It was just painful. So from a physicality perspective, obvious that staff is huge, which is expected. But what I think was particularly interesting for me, and that's something I think people should focus on when they're dealing with junior players that are going into the senior setup. The majority of junior players said that they had really personal and good relationships with their coaches on high school, and then also on junior level. And they said like they feel like more cared about. And the moment they enter the senior setup and they understand that it's more professional, but this whole personal relationship to coaches get lost, and they kind of feeling like there's not really enough They don't really get the feedback they need. They don't really get like they are scared of like making mistakes and exposing themselves, and they didn't feel like and I had players from different environments. It was not just one environment, it was different ones. They said like they felt more coaches on senior level are more like selectors for the squad. They didn't really see like they didn't really look at them as someone who's really developing them and who's really helping them. They actually just their only concern all the time was like, am I get selected? I just have to look as good as possible in front of those coaches, otherwise I'm not getting game time. And like one player said it quite he said like they are not coaches, they're actually just judges of how I perform in that environment. And that was for me kind of I've seen it a couple of times in other sports before, like more subjectively in team sports, where I felt like, well, players when they enter the senior setup from junior, like kind of this whole development kind of stops for them, and they only just trying to impress, and they're just trying to work as hard as possible in order to get game time. And there is not much actual development happening. But a player told me like they expect me to be a polished player, and I asked him like, what does it mean polished? And then he said like they expect me to be done like a senior player done. The moment you enter the senior environment, you have to perform like a senior, but at the end of the day I'm still 19 years old, and I can't match the physicality, and I can't match the game understanding, the tactics that the 29-year-old has, or the 30-year-old. So it's kind of, there's really not that much focus on development, which was also due to the lack of relationship with the coaches.
From your perspective, would you say in your research that you found, was it more of that, the increase in speed, the increase in physicality, or that increase in disconnect that, was the biggest limiting factor of why those players did end up in that graveyard, as you said?
Yeah, in my or this is also part of my discussion. The majority of players, they expect that they know kind of that the physicality is different, and they also have no problem with, okay, they're trying to match the new demands or the new physical and tactical demands, etc. But what they are lacking is a support system around them that's helping them to achieve it, basically. So I think the biggest problem or issue for junior players in the senior setup is first that expectation from coaches that they already like come and fit in immediately, and then there's like a big lack of feedback and a big lack of actually still developing those players. And that's for the majority of them, that's the biggest issue. It's not they know like, okay, it takes maybe 2 or 3 years, especially if you have the props or like the locks. It's more with locks than actually even with props. They say, well, I still need to just get stronger, faster, etc. Well, I kind of know that and expect that. What is the problem for them is like not getting enough feedback, especially from a tactical perspective, how to like develop that speed of or how to develop that game understanding, and to play the game much faster. Because it's not just like the playing the game much faster, it's also faster decision making, and this is what they are really where the majority of them are struggling. And on senior level, and I think that's all of them were aware of that, you have everyone is good, and everyone is a good player on senior level, and you don't get away with just talent. What usually on junior level you get away when you are a bit more physical, you're a bit more talented than others, you get away with that. On senior level you don't, and this is like then the hard truth and the hard reality. And then they have kind of a lack of support from coaches in order to deal with that new situation.
For anybody, again, for myself that might not understand, or other American listeners out there that don't follow the different transition from senior to junior, is there differences in playing style that could have also affected that, where junior players that were in a similar system, schematically, technical, tactical,
Yeah.
does that make it easier? Is that a smoother transition because um, they don't have to be developed as much because it's a similar playing style, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, so what was really interesting is that one player said on junior level I could do whatever I want, and like the coaches gave me so much freedom because the coaches didn't really have that much tactical understanding.
Now,
So
was
he
that
said,
because he
like,
was just talented than everybody else? Because you just mentioned that the
yeah,
talent level wasn't as high,
and
so they were just happy to have him there. And
yeah, no. So, for example, they were more talented than others. You have a lot more schools than you have obviously senior setups, so or senior teams. So you have and you have a lot more also under 20 teams than you have than the squad that's playing international or playing, for example, USC or a domestic competition. At the end, it's a lot of players get on junior level. They got a lot of they can play very creative because they are just better than others. So they can make these, and that's where you always see what you always see in the highlight videos. They can make these extreme like steps and long runs and or like chases or whatever. They have a lot more freedom on junior level because the level between the players is just so different. So that's what's happening on junior level. They don't really have that much restrictions to a game plan, or they don't have that many structures. And then the moment they get into the senior setup, like the level is more even between the players, and you have a lot more tactical coaching, and you have a lot more structure, and the players are expected to follow those structures and play certain shapes, etc. And then they kind of struggle with that because they can't do these cool moves that they did on junior level anymore.
so is that something that you actually found and was able to try to bring back to people at the junior level, is understanding like, hey, if to help bridge the gap, like start introducing some of these more sets and technicals to bridge that
Yeah.
gap, so that way the game looks more what it will look like.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest changes that we could make, or that would be easier to make, and we all even tried that with the under 20s a bit, is having just better meetings and increasing the quality of like how meetings happen and how we discuss tactics, and how we discuss or how we review games, and then how we prepare the next game, because the majority of players on junior level, they don't really develop in a complete understanding for a more tactical approach. But I think that's also very South African specific. Like they play very, very, very structured rugby on senior level, and but they are not really prepared for that on junior level. So on junior level, they can really play very creative, and they can really have a lot more autonomy than they have then on senior level, which should be actually the opposite a little bit. We try to have better structured meetings. We try to have a bit more trying to change like the pedagogical approach on how we let them review games and how we let them prepare tactically for the next game. So we try to give them certain frameworks, and then asking them like how they would make certain decisions for the positions. We group them into position like into positional groups basically, letting them have conversations, and like in general getting a bit more tactical understanding, which I hope, like I haven't measured that obviously, but I hope that this helps a bit to deal with that more, like with especially with more cognitive load they have then on senior level, and follow those game plans and all those different structures.
You said something there that made me think, have you stayed in contact with any of your friends or colleagues that are working in different places where, like you said, okay, South African rugby is very structured at the senior level. Is there,
Yeah.
is that not the norm at other places where maybe the transition is easier and what you found was only, at that specific sample and
Yeah.
population? Have you continued this conversation for further, for lack of a better term, but your further research?
Yeah. So I try to get a bit of an try to get some input from how the French rugby system operates, because in my personal opinion right now that's a really they have proven that they have like really developed really good development pathways for young players through their academies and kind of like bleeding in, or we say, I don't know if you say that in the US, but we say we bleeding in players slowly into different into senior teams and not throwing them into a shark's tank and letting them try to survive. Like in the French system, they have a professional first league and a professional second league. And a lot of youth players go through the academies and they get or they go into different clubs and play and get senior experience in the second division, not already on the top level, but in the second division. And they're having a slower, more structured inclusion of junior players into the professional setups, which I think is the way to go. I'm personally like very skeptical about having 19-year-olds and 18, 19 or even some 20-year-olds already in full in the senior teams. It's sometimes like, especially Twitter is, or rugby Twitter is really painful. So South African rugby Twitter is the most painful ever. I think that's more painful than SSC Twitter. But they are calling for 19-year-olds to be included in the Springbok squads, etc. And these players haven't even played two games on senior level. So it's, I think, in the future, I think there must be special development. Doesn't stop after under 20 level. In France, they have understood that. They have kind of understood that, and they actually looking at until from 20 to 23, they have development plans for those players to slowly integrate them into the senior setups, which is like, I think, the way to go in this sport. But in general, if I would talk about other sports as well, I think we have to stop expecting 20-year-olds to be full professional players, and have individualized, or not fully individualized, because it's barely possible on pro level, but at least having a plan for that phase between 20 and 23, and like that transition into the senior setup. I think we're losing a lot by just throwing players in and hoping that they're just surviving. One player even said it to me. I said, it's a shark tank and you're just trying to survive. And it's a survival of the best. It's a survival of the best, obviously, which works, which is like, you don't need to, you can look at it from a negative perspective, but also from a positive perspective. Well, this is just how it is. But you can also try to maybe make it a bit better for them and a bit smoother in doing that transition.
How are you able to apply the principles that you learned from this master's dissertation and apply, like you said, the principles to the group of people that you're working with now, being again a younger population? And how are you able to collaborate with head coaches and just put it all into action now?
Yeah, first of all, I think the lowest hanging fruit in this is educating coaches about like maturation, and telling them that a 19-year-old is not a grown. And I know I said that to one player before, for one under 20 player before, and he hated me for that. I said, I'm sorry, but you're not a grown man. So, and you're not. So don't ever do that to 19-year-olds. It's not a good idea, but like, I did it in a very joking way. So but I think the first thing is to understand that they are not full grown adults. not cognitively, not even physically. I mean, like we see that in the NBA, that they get drafted and they still grow a couple of centimeters, so they're not fully developed, but we put the same but they're facing all the same pressures and physical demands that fully grown players face. So I think we, first of all, I try to educate coaches a lot about maturation, and not just from a physical perspective, but also from like a cognitive perspective, because the majority of 19, 20-year-olds are not able to deal with the challenges of being a professional athlete, at least not in sports that have a kind of like that have a lot of other forms of pressure, like media, etc. So the majority of them are not able to deal with the majority of demands you have in pro sports. So first of all, education about maturation. And second of all, trying to have an actual development plan for when they leave the age groups or when they leave junior level, and are integrated in the senior setup, and having kind of a plan for at least 2 years. I would rather say 3, but like having a plan for 2 or 3 years, how this transition into the senior setup should actually happen, and not throwing a young player in and then saying, okay, you're above the seniors now, which is and you have to do exactly the same things they do, because that usually is extremely stressful for them. And I think that's where we also lose them then, or they are not able to perform how we want them to perform. So having kind of like a development plan for when they are in the first 2 or 3 years of in the professional setup, from an S&C perspective, but also from like a mental skills perspective, etc. And what does it actually mean to be a professional player? That's I think that's what most struggle with the most.
What would be, kind of to wrap it up and put a bow on it, for any of the coaches that are working in a similar situation that you were, right? Like, what would be your biggest piece of advice to them to do those things? Okay, hey, this is the method or the principle. Now, here's some of the methods that we found, like, hey, whether it was common injuries, were they more contact, were they more from the high speed of the game, whether it be changing direction or, high speed distance running? What would be some of the practical things that you would say, hey, make sure you're hitting these and hitting these buckets?
Yeah, so from a practical and especially S&C perspective, the first thing is like actually familiarize yourself with load management, and familiarize yourself with actually the differences of physical demands between the junior level and the senior level. I rarely have seen any coaches to actually understand how big the gap is. And they like how big, like how even from a training perspective, how much more training you have on senior level compared to the junior level, and also how different the intensities are, and how different also the cognitive load they face are. For example, the majority of junior players, they have 2 meetings a week. On senior level, you have like you have a game review, you have several meetings, etc. It's also a huge cognitive load. So first practical advice would be really try to find out what the gap is between the junior level the kids played at, and the senior level that they are doing now. The same as with the transition from high school to college, for example. If you are in that transition, like really try to figure out what the gap really is. Hopefully, I hope there are some high school coaches that also track a bit of do a bit of like tracking or collecting data, but really try. That's the first thing I would do. And then identify the additional demands that these players don't face on junior level. As I said before, especially this increase in meetings and increase in like cognitive load that they face with new structures, with having all of a sudden a completely different schedule. Try to get a feeling for, not a feeling, but try to identify demands that they have on senior level that they don't had on the level before. For example, with the players I had, all of a sudden they had to do interviews, media. They've never really done that on junior level, and then they also never really practiced that.
Yeah, that never gets taught down at that level either.
No, it only gets taught on senior level then when they actually when
hey, here's the microphone, go ahead and speak. Like,
yeah. So a player said something that's not in my dissertation, or it's not in my paper, but that's something that really is stuck with me at all times. He said to me, they only care about you and they only develop you when they need you. And this is like really stuck with me because it applies to everything that I've seen and I've experienced. It's like they actually only care about players when they need them, and everything only gets like, they get introduced to certain things only when it's like urgent. Like the same with media, like never done that before. All of a sudden they play their first senior cap, all the media is on them. And then they said, okay, we have to do media training with you now, like in the week, like in that week that you're playing your first cap. And they're already like super nervous about their first game and everything that's going on. And then the media guy comes and tells them he has to do a media briefing with them now. And they completely like, lost it. And everything is just too much. So I think that's one thing for coaches to identify which additional stresses and do I have on senior level all of a sudden. There are also so many other things that we've seen, or that all of a sudden come to them when it comes to their normal life, which are then have a huge impact in how they operate. So for example, in South Africa, that's in rugby, they usually go to rugby schools. They are fully integrated in boarding schools. The majority of them, they get 3 meals a day. Then they graduate, and all of a sudden they have to live on their own and get an apartment and have to cook their own meals and stuff, like, or at least have breakfast at home in the morning. And all of a sudden they are actually living normal life, but they have not experienced that before. I had players in the senior setup, like they came from junior level, they were not able to cook scrambled eggs. And then you have these nutrition talks and everything. And I was like, dude, I know you don't even know what the difference is between a pan and a pot. But that's that you have, like, all of a sudden they have like these life issues and figuring out all of that. And then they figuring out like their rugby side or the professional sports side. And it just identify additional stresses. And then just communicate very well with sports coaches. And actually, I'm personally, I don't know how it is in the US, but I always try to learn as much as possible about the sports that I'm working in. So I really, really understand the sport that I'm working in. I cannot imagine actually working with athletes where I haven't watched how they compete, or have not really dived deep into how the sport works. That makes it, as a strength and conditioning coach at least, that makes it a bit easier to understand the physical demands. Like I've never played rugby, even though I've been in rugby for a very long time, but it was really, really helpful that I had a lot of players who taught me everything about their positions. And I can tackle and I can scrum and I can do and I kind of know how it feels, even though I never really played. But try to really learn about the sports you're coaching, and also a bit of like how the differences then are from a technical perspective from junior to senior level. For example, what I had now, I had a player who came from a school or came from a junior setup, and they changed, he played one position the whole time. And he came into the senior setup and they changed his position completely. and he had, all of a sudden he had complete different demands. And from an SSC perspective, we try to make that transition from a position that required different skills to that new position that was way more like, so he basically changed from if you both understand rugby, so he changed from being a fly off to being a center, which are, from a decision making perspective, are different demands, which also from a physical perspective are different demands. And I really try to have a conversation with their player and try to, like, from an SNC perspective, individualize a bit for him so that this transition is easier for him. I know that is probably, if people are working with, in the US, for example, in different sports where you have so many different, or where you're coaching so many athletes, stuff like that's probably not possible. But if you have the chance to do such things, try to help them try to be interested in their sport, and also in different changes that might happen for them in the sport, and try with programming, etc. Try to help them a bit to achieve that maybe a bit quicker. So yeah, that would be, I think, my, like, the advice I would give for someone who's dealing with such athletes.
Elisabeth, thank you for coming on and talking with us about all this. You mentioned your Twitter at the beginning of it. So if you want to let people know where they can follow you, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, but yeah, just let people know where they can follow you and your work.
Yeah, I'm horrible on Instagram, and the algorithms never work for me, so it's not that great for me. But Twitter is EO Performance, and I have a website as well. I usually answer messages most of the time, yeah, if someone wants to reach out or ask questions, I'm very happy for that, to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure people will be reaching out to you. So thank you again for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.